When you think of Italy, what comes to mind? Beautiful coastlines, rich pasta dishes, historic cities, ancient ruins. But behind the postcard-perfect views lies something darker, something they don't show in the travel brochures. Welcome to the hidden side of Italy, the one they don't want you to know about. Chapter 1. The Cursed Village of Krakow. High on a cliff in southern Italy sits Krakow, an eerie ghost town frozen in time. Once a thriving medieval village, it was abandoned after landslides and earthquakes made it unlivable. But locals believe it's not just geology that drove people away. They whisper of a curse, an ancient betrayal buried in its foundations. Today, Krakow stands completely deserted and honestly, completely unsettling. Krakow sits perched dramatically on a 400-meter-high cliff in the Basilicata region of southern Italy, about 25 miles inland from the Gulf of Taranto. Think of it as nature's own fortress. The medieval builders chose this location precisely because the steep, rocky terrain provided natural defense against invaders. The village clings to the hillside like a stone crown, with its buildings seeming to grow organically from the very rock itself. This geographic positioning, while offering protection, also contained the seeds of Krakow's eventual abandonment. The underlying geology consists of clay and soft sedimentary rock, materials that, while initially stable, become highly susceptible to erosion and landslides when subjected to centuries of weathering. To truly understand Krakow's story, we need to trace its evolution through several distinct phases. First, let's look at the medieval foundation. Spanning from the 8th to the 11th centuries, Krakow began as a strategic outpost during the Byzantine period and later flourished under Norman rule. The imposing Norman tower that still dominates the skyline today was built around the year 1000 as both a watchtower and a symbol of feudal power. During this period, the village's elevated position made it a crucial link in the communication and defense network across southern Italy. Moving on to the Golden Age, which lasted from the 12th to the 16th centuries, this was Krakow's period of greatest prosperity. The population grew to around 2,000 inhabitants, and the village became a regional center for agriculture, especially grain production. The fertile valleys below the cliff provided excellent farmland, while the elevated position continued to offer security. Churches, palaces, and civic buildings were constructed during this time, creating the architectural framework that visitors see today. But then, the decline began, roughly from the 17th to the 19th centuries. Several factors started to erode Krakow's viability. Political changes reduced its strategic importance, while economic shifts drew people toward larger cities and coastal areas. More critically, the area began experiencing increased seismic activity and the first signs of serious geological instability. Finally, we reach the modern crisis and abandonment in the 20th century. The last chapter of Krakow's inhabited history unfolded dramatically in the 1900s. A series of landslides between 1892 and 1922 damaged significant portions of the village. The situation only worsened between 1959 and 1972, when massive landslides made many areas uninhabitable. The final blow came in 1980, when a major earthquake struck the region, rendering the remaining structures too dangerous for occupation. The curse of Krakow, if we can call it that, lies primarily in its geological foundation. The village sits on what geologists call argille azzurre. That's blue clay formations that are particularly susceptible to a process called mass wasting. Think of it this way. Imagine building a sandcastle at the beach. At first, slightly damp sand holds together well, but as water conditions change, either too much water or too little, the structure becomes unstable. Krakow's clay foundation behaves similarly over centuries. Seasonal rainfall, combined with the natural properties of clay soil, created conditions where the ground beneath the village literally began to flow downhill. The process, well, it accelerated due to several factors. Deforestation in the surrounding areas reduced the root systems that helped hold soil in place. Changing agricultural practices altered water drainage patterns, and the increasing frequency of seismic activity in the region created additional stress on the already unstable ground. Just off the coast of Venice lies Poveglia, a small island with a terrifying history. Used as a quarantine zone during plague outbreaks, It later became a mental asylum. Thousands died here, and some say their souls never left. It's now banned to the public. But those who've trespassed report screams in the night and ghostly apparitions. Locals call it the Island of the Dead. Picture the Venetian lagoon as a complex network of waterways, islands, and marshlands. Poveglia sits strategically positioned between Venice and the Lido, occupying roughly 17 acres in the southern part of the lagoon. This location might seem idyllic, surrounded by water, close to one of the world's most beautiful cities. But geography often determines destiny in ways we don't initially expect. The island's position made it valuable for two contradictory purposes throughout history: as a place of refuge and as a place of isolation. This duality would prove central to understanding Poveglia's tragic story. When you're surrounded by water, you're both protected from the outside world and completely cut off from it, a double-edged geographical sword that Venice would exploit for centuries. To understand Poveglia's reputation, we must first grasp the devastating impact of plague on medieval and Renaissance Europe. Imagine a disease so virulent that it could kill half the population of a city within months. The bubonic plague, or Black Death, struck Europe repeatedly between the 14th and 18th centuries, creating a level of terror and desperation that's difficult for us to comprehend today. Venice, as a major trading port, was particularly vulnerable to plague outbreaks. Ships arriving from infected regions could introduce the disease to the city's dense population within days. The Venetian authorities, recognizing this threat, developed a systematic approach to quarantine that would transform Poveglia into something resembling a vision from Dante's Inferno. The quarantine system: how isolation became horror. Here's where we need to understand the logic behind Venice's use of Poveglia. The concept of quarantine, originally 40 giorni or 40 days, was based on the belief that diseases had an incubation period, after which healthy individuals could safely return to society. In theory, this was a sound public health measure. In practice on Poveglia, it became a death sentence for thousands. Think of Poveglia as Venice's solution to an impossible problem. How do you protect a city from plague while still maintaining trade relationships essential to survival? The island became a holding area where ships' crews and passengers suspected of carrying disease were detained. But consider the psychological and physical reality of this system: sick and healthy people confined together on a small island, with minimal medical care, inadequate food supplies, and the constant presence of death. The island's facilities evolved over time to accommodate this grim purpose. Dormitories were built to house the quarantined, along with medical facilities and, inevitably, crematoriums. The soil of Poveglia gradually became a mixture of earth and human ash, a fact that would later contribute to the island's agricultural fertility in the most macabre way imaginable. The scale of death on Poveglia is, honestly, staggering. Historical records suggest that over 160,000 people died on the island during its centuries of use as a quarantine station. To put this in perspective, just imagine a modern city the size of Syracuse, New York, or maybe Savannah, Georgia. Every single resident dying in the same small location, stretched out over several hundred years. The concentration of death in such a confined space created what we might call a thanatological landscape. Basically, a place where death became the dominant feature of the environment. The bodies were, at first, buried in mass graves, but as the death toll kept mounting and space became scarce, the Venetian authorities eventually turned to cremation. Massive pyres burned almost continuously, sending columns of smoke across the lagoon that served as a constant reminder to Venice of the price of survival. The ash from these fires mixed with the soil, creating the eerily fertile ground that still, to this day, characterizes the island. The psychiatric hospital era, adding madness to death. If Poveglia's story had ended with the plague years, it might have eventually been remembered as a tragic but necessary sacrifice for public health. However, in 1922, Italian authorities decided to construct a psychiatric hospital on the island, unknowingly adding yet another layer to its dark reputation. Consider the symbolism here. An island already saturated with death and suffering became home to people society deemed mentally ill. The hospital operated until 1968, and during this period, stories emerged of experimental treatments, patient abuse, and mysterious deaths. While we really have to be careful to separate documented history from legend, the concentration of human suffering in one location across different historical periods created a narrative that seemed to confirm Poveglia as a place where normal rules of humanity just didn't apply. Today, Poveglia remains largely abandoned, accessible only by private boat and, officially closed to tourism. The Italian government has occasionally considered development projects, but the island's reputation and the practical challenges of building on ground mixed with human remains have, prevented significant modernization. The island has become a magnet for paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and those fascinated by dark history. However, it's important to approach these interests with respect for the genuine human suffering that occurred there. The stories of supernatural activity, while compelling, should not overshadow the very real historical tragedy that created the island's reputation. Understanding the psychology of cursed places, Poveglia raises some really fascinating questions about how places end up with reputations for being cursed or haunted. From a psychological perspective, we can kind of see why people might feel uneasy in locations that are tied to mass death and suffering. The concentration of tragedy creates what we might call a psychogeographical weight, that sense that a place actually carries the emotional residue of past events. Whether you believe in supernatural phenomena or not, Poveglia shows us how historical trauma can become embedded in both the physical and cultural landscape of a place. The island serves as a reminder that, honestly, some human experiences are so intense they seem to leave permanent marks on the locations where they happened. Deep below Vatican City lies one of the most secretive places on Earth, the Vatican Secret Archives. Thousands of documents are hidden from the public, some dating back over 1,000 years. So, what's inside? Suppressed texts, letters from kings and popes, and possibly even evidence of supernatural events. Only a select few are ever allowed inside. What is the church hiding? And, well, why? Before we dive into the depths of what's actually stored in these archives, let's address the elephant in the room, the word secret. When most people hear Vatican Secret Archives, they imagine Dan Brown novels, conspiracy theories, and hidden chambers filled with explosive revelations about Christianity. The reality is both more mundane and honestly more fascinating than fiction. The Latin word secretum doesn't mean secret in the conspiratorial sense we tend to think of today. Instead, it actually means private or personal. Think of it kind of like a private office rather than a locked vault of forbidden knowledge. These archives contain the Pope's private correspondence, administrative documents, and the day-to-day bureaucratic records of running what is basically a sovereign state that's existed for over 1,000 years. Just imagine if you could access the... Understanding the foundation, why southern Italy became fertile ground. Before we can understand how mafia organizations developed their power, we need to examine the historical conditions that made their emergence almost inevitable. Picture Italy, in the mid-1800s, just after unification in 1861. The newly formed Italian state faced an enormous challenge. How do you govern territories that had been separate kingdoms for centuries, each with different laws, customs, and economic systems? Think of it like this. Imagine if the United States government suddenly had to integrate 50 completely different countries, each speaking different dialects, operating under different legal systems, and having vastly different levels of economic development. The Italian state's response was to impose northern Italian administrative systems on the south, often without understanding local conditions or needs. Southern Italy at this time was predominantly agricultural, with a feudal-like system where large landowners controlled vast estates worked by desperately poor peasants. When the new Italian state abolished feudalism and began redistributing land, it created a power vacuum. The central government was too weak and distant to maintain order effectively, especially in rural areas where the nearest police station might be days away by horseback. This is where we encounter the first crucial concept for understanding mafia development, the idea of protection as a commodity. In areas where the state cannot effectively protect property rights, enforce contracts, or maintain order, private protection becomes valuable. Criminal organizations didn't initially seize power through violence alone. They filled a genuine need for security services that the legitimate government couldn't provide. The birth of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, a case study in organizational evolution. Let's examine how the Sicilian Mafia, or Cosa Nostra, evolved from this chaotic post-unification environment. The organization didn't spring up overnight as a criminal conspiracy. Instead, it developed gradually from groups of armed guards hired by landowners to protect their estates and oversee agricultural workers. Consider the economic logic at work here. Large landowners needed someone to collect rents from tenant farmers, prevent theft of crops and livestock, and maintain discipline among workers. The state police were unreliable and often corrupt themselves. Private guards, many of them former bandits or soldiers from various armies that had crisscrossed Sicily during the Unification Wars, offered their services to fill this need. These guards gradually realized they could increase their value by creating the very problems they were hired to solve. Think of it as a protection racket in its purest form. The same people who offered to protect you from bandits might actually be organizing the banditry. This created what economists call a monopoly of violence in specific territories, areas where one group controlled all use of force, both legitimate and illegitimate. The organizational structure that emerged from this process is fascinating from a sociological perspective. The Cosa Nostra developed what we might call a cellular structure, small groups called families that controlled specific territories, but were connected through complex networks of alliances, marriages, and mutual obligations. Each family operated independently in its own area while recognizing the authority of other families in their territories. The 'Ndrangheta understanding Calabria's unique criminal evolution. Now let's contrast the Sicilian model with the 'Ndrangheta of Calabria, which represents a different evolutionary path for organized crime. While the Cosa Nostra developed primarily from agricultural protection services, the 'Ndrangheta emerged from the specific geographic and social conditions of Calabria's mountainous terrain. Calabria's landscape is crucial to understanding this organization. Picture a region of steep mountains, isolated valleys, and small villages connected by difficult mountain paths. This geography created natural hideouts for bandits, and made it extremely difficult for central authorities to maintain control. The 'Ndrangheta developed what we might call a clan-based rather than territory-based structure. Unlike Cosa Nostra families, which were primarily business organizations bound together by oath and mutual interest, 'Ndrangheta clans are actually based on blood relationships. Think of them as extended family businesses where membership is determined by birth rather than recruitment. This creates both strengths and weaknesses. Blood ties make the organization incredibly difficult for law enforcement to penetrate, but they also limit flexibility in recruitment and expansion. The 'Ndrangheta's evolution demonstrates an important principle about criminal organizations. They adapt to their environment like any other social institution. Calabria's poverty and isolation created different opportunities and challenges than Sicily's agricultural wealth, so the criminal organizations that emerged developed different characteristics. The Camorra Naples and the urban criminal model. The Camorra of Naples and Campania represents yet another evolutionary path, one shaped by urban rather than rural conditions. To understand the Camorra, you need to picture Naples as it existed in the 19th century, a densely packed city with extreme poverty, limited economic opportunities, and a weak state presence in working-class neighborhoods. Unlike the territorial control exercised by Cosa Nostra or the clan structure of the 'Ndrangheta, the Camorra developed what we might call a market-based approach to criminal activity. Think of it as organized crime adapted to urban capitalism. Rather than controlling specific territories absolutely, Camorra groups competed and collaborated in various illegal markets: smuggling, extortion, illegal gambling, and eventually drug trafficking. This urban environment created different organizational pressures. Camorra groups had to be more flexible and opportunistic than their rural counterparts. They couldn't rely on isolated territories or blood relationships for security, so they developed more fluid alliances and more complex relationships with legitimate businesses and political authorities. The Camorra's evolution also demonstrates how criminal organizations adapt to economic. The physical reality, a city built on layers. To understand the Vatican archives, you need to visualize Vatican City not as a single building, but as an archaeological site where each generation has built upon the previous one. Think of it like a historical layer cake, where each level tells a different story about human civilization. The lowest levels contain remnants of ancient Roman structures, including parts of Nero's circus, where according to tradition, St. Peter was martyred. Above that you find early Christian churches and monuments. Then come medieval constructions, Renaissance additions, and modern archival facilities. The archives themselves are scattered throughout this complex, with some documents stored in climate-controlled modern facilities, while others remain in Renaissance-era rooms that have housed papal correspondence for centuries. The Vatican occupies only 121 acres, but within that space you have over 50 miles of shelving containing documents that span nearly 2 millennia. To put this in perspective, if you tried to read one document per day, you would need approximately 40,000 years to review everything currently cataloged, and that's assuming you could read Latin, medieval Italian, ancient Greek, and dozens of other languages fluently. What's actually down there? The documentary treasures. Let's walk through the archives systematically, starting with what we know exists, and working toward the more mysterious aspects. Think of this as taking a guided tour through the administrative heart of Western civilization. The diplomatic correspondence section contains letters between the Vatican and world leaders spanning centuries. Here you'll find correspondence with Charlemagne, Henry VIII's requests for marriage annulments, letters from Napoleon during his conflicts with the Church, and diplomatic exchanges during both world wars. These documents provide an unparalleled view of European and world history from the Church's perspective. Consider this: when Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, the entire process generated hundreds of documents, legal briefs, theological arguments, diplomatic protests, and personal letters. All of these still exist in the archives. You can literally trace the English Reformation through papal correspondence, seeing how a personal marital dispute evolved into a religious schism that changed the course of history. The Inquisition records represent perhaps the most controversial section of the archives. These documents detail the activities of the Roman Inquisition from 1542 to 1903. Before you imagine torture chambers and witch hunts, understand that these records are primarily legal documents, trial transcripts, correspondence between inquisitors, and administrative records of what was essentially a religious court system. The famous trial of Galileo Galilei is documented here in extraordinary detail. You can read the actual transcripts of his interrogations, see his handwritten recantation, and follow the political and theological debates that surrounded his case. This isn't just about one scientist's persecution. It's a window into how the Church struggled to reconcile traditional religious teaching with emerging scientific knowledge. The mysterious and controversial, what we don't fully know. Now we come to the more intriguing aspects of the Vatican archives, the documents that exist but remain classified, restricted, or simply haven't been fully studied by independent scholars. World War II documents represent one of the most contentious areas. The Vatican's role during World War II, particularly regarding the Holocaust and fascist regimes, remains a subject of intense historical debate. In 2019, Pope Francis opened archives from the pontificate of Pius XII, covering the years 1939 to 1958. But scholars are still working through these documents. Early findings suggest a complex picture of a church trying to navigate between moral responsibility and political survival. Consider the ethical complexity here. The Vatican received detailed reports about Nazi atrocities, including the Holocaust, from bishops and nuncios across Europe. The archives contain these reports along with internal discussions about how to respond. Did the Church do enough to oppose genocide? Could it have done more without risking greater harm to Catholics under Nazi occupation? These questions can only be answered by carefully studying the archived correspondence. Financial records from various periods remain restricted, particularly those dealing with the Vatican Bank, officially the Institute for the Works of Religion. This institution has been implicated in various financial scandals over the decades, and the archives likely contain detailed records of its operations, though these remain largely inaccessible to outside researchers. The Third Secret of Fatima represents a perfect example of how the Vatican manages sensitive information. This prophetic vision, supposedly received by 3 children in Portugal in 1917, was kept secret for decades. When finally revealed in 2000, many felt the published version was incomplete. The archives likely contain the complete documentation of this incident, including internal church discussions about how to handle prophetic claims. Understanding the access problem, why so much remains hidden. Here's where we need to understand the practical and political challenges of managing such vast archives. The Vatican faces a unique problem. How do you provide scholarly access to documents that could be politically sensitive, personally embarrassing to historical figures, or potentially damaging to the Church's reputation? Consider the logistics alone. The Vatican employs a small staff of archivists and scholars to manage 50 miles of documents. Most of these materials haven't been digitized, and many exist in only one copy. Allowing unrestricted access could literally destroy irreplaceable historical documents through handling. Additionally, many documents are written in archaic forms of Latin, medieval Italian, or other languages that require specialized expertise to interpret correctly. The Vatican has traditionally opened archives 75 years after a pope's death, though this has been reduced to 70 years recently. This means that documents from the 1950s are just becoming available now. The reasoning behind this delay relates to protecting the privacy of people who might still be alive, and avoiding diplomatic complications with nations that might be embarrassed by historical revelations. Let's examine their revenue streams methodically. Traditional extortion, demanding payment from businesses for protection, remains important, but it's evolved far beyond simple shakedowns. Modern mafia protection services include debt collection, dispute resolution, and even legitimate security services. Think of it as a parallel legal system that operates in areas where the official legal system is slow, corrupt, or ineffective. Drug trafficking represents the most lucrative modern activity for these organizations. The 'Ndrangheta, in particular, has become one of the world's most powerful cocaine trafficking networks, with connections spanning from South American producers to European consumers. Their success in this area demonstrates how traditional organizational strengths, secrecy, violence capability, and international connections through immigration can be adapted to new criminal opportunities. Money laundering has become increasingly sophisticated, with mafia organizations investing in legitimate businesses, real estate, and financial instruments. This isn't just about hiding criminal proceeds, it's about integrating criminal and legitimate economies so thoroughly that they become difficult to separate. The political dimension of organized crime, it's pretty complicated. Perhaps the most complex aspect of understanding mafia power involves analyzing their relationships with legitimate political and economic institutions. These relationships aren't simply about corruption in the sense of officials taking bribes. Instead, they represent what scholars call state capture, situations where criminal organizations become so embedded in legitimate institutions that the boundary between legal and illegal authority becomes blurred. Consider how this works in practice. A mafia organization that controls construction contracts in a region doesn't just extort individual builders. They become stakeholders in economic development, with interests in zoning decisions, infrastructure projects, and political appointments. Politicians need their cooperation to get things done, while the criminal organization needs political protection to operate. This creates what we might call gray areas, where criminal and legitimate authority overlap. A mafia boss might simultaneously be involved in drug trafficking and serve as an informal mediator in business disputes that the courts cannot handle effectively. The same organization that engages in extortion might also provide genuine security services and economic coordination that benefit their communities. The internationalization process, from local to global. One of the most significant developments in mafia evolution has been their transformation from local organizations to international networks. This process accelerated dramatically in the late 20th century, driven by several factors that we need to examine systematically. Immigration patterns created the initial foundation for international expansion. As Southern Italians migrated to North America, Australia, and Northern Europe throughout the 20th century, they carried social networks and cultural patterns that could be adapted to criminal purposes. However, it's important to understand that, most immigrants were honest people seeking legitimate opportunities. Criminal organizations followed migration patterns. They didn't create them. The globalization of legitimate trade created new opportunities for criminal enterprise. As international commerce became more complex and less regulated, criminal organizations found ways to exploit shipping networks, banking systems, and trade relationships. The 'Ndrangheta's success in cocaine trafficking, for example, depends on their ability to coordinate activities across multiple continents and navigate complex international shipping and financial systems. Modern challenges: how these organizations adapt to changing conditions. To understand why mafia organizations have proven so resilient, we need to examine how they've adapted to modern challenges like increased law enforcement pressure, economic changes, and social transformation in southern Italy. Law enforcement efforts have become increasingly sophisticated. using electronic surveillance, financial investigations, and international cooperation to combat organized crime. Mafia organizations have responded by becoming more decentralized, more careful about communications, and more deeply embedded in legitimate businesses. Economic development in southern Italy has created both opportunities and challenges for criminal organizations. Improved infrastructure and increased investment have provided new opportunities for infiltration and money laundering. At the same time, rising living standards and expanded educational opportunities have reduced the pool of potential recruits and increased public opposition to criminal activity. The European Union's anti-mafia efforts represent a particularly interesting case study in how criminal organizations adapt to changing political environments. EU anti-money laundering regulations and increased judicial cooperation have made traditional criminal activities more difficult, but they've also created new opportunities for regulatory arbitrage and cross-border criminal enterprise. The cultural dimension, understanding community relationships. One aspect of mafia power that outsiders often struggle to understand involves the complex relationships these organizations maintain with their home communities. These aren't simply predatory relationships where criminals exploit helpless victims. Instead, they represent what anthropologists call embedded relationships where criminal and legitimate social structures are intertwined in complex ways. In areas with strong mafia presence, these organizations often provide services that the state cannot or will not provide effectively. They resolve disputes, provide informal credit, offer protection from other criminals, and sometimes even provide disaster relief and social support. This creates a situation where many community members simultaneously fear and depend on criminal organizations. This relationship helps explain why anti-mafia efforts have sometimes failed, despite strong law enforcement pressure and significant economic development. Criminal organizations maintain legitimacy in their communities not just through intimidation, but by providing genuine services and maintaining social networks that people depend on for survival and prosperity.